Welcome to Success with Significance. I'm Darryl Baskin of the Baskin Real Estate Specialist at eXp Realty. Here with Clarence Oliver Jr. and this is going to be a great program. You know, one of the reasons I enjoy this program is we're meeting people, we're seeing things around town all the time, and we never really know the story behind them. And I value that story and would like to share it with you instead of having my own private cup of coffee and not leaving you with any of the information. So, Dr. Oliver, thanks for being with us. And I don't know, do we have his name tag up yet, the character plate? Okay, well, I asked you what you did. I said, what's your title now? Because I'm going through all this stuff that you've done, and the 3-page minimized biography, I don't know how you would take any of that out. And I'm trying to figure out what to put on here. And you said, well, you giggled a little bit. So I just put extraordinary citizen. Wow. Because I had nothing better to encapsulate all. We've got limited amount of space on the screen. But I think that as much as I did it kind of to be fun, I think it may really say who you are. And maybe you've gathered that through all these awards and things that you've received over the years, but it's really true. I've got to tell you this story too. I'll let you talk in a minute. I'm sitting in a board meeting. I think it was junior achievement, and I don't know, how long have you been on the board?
About 40 years.
Okay, well, sometime, and I was hoping that it would give me some way to tell when this was, but I've been on the board for a while, and I just remember sitting in the room and younger, and I hear your name, and I ask myself, how did I get here? I mean, how did I get in this room with such a distinguished man? And when you read some of the stories and things that you've done, it's pretty incredible. So let's talk about it. What did you do, like right out of high school?
That's an interesting question, because in the 1940s, people could still enter into apprenticeships, and immediately after the war, after World War II. Jobs were very difficult for young people to obtain because all the veterans were returning home, and I finished high school just at that time, at the end of World War II. And I had developed an interest in photography as a young person, even before I even thought about that as a possible career, but I had done a lot of reading in the library about photography, and had my family had an ancient camera that was purchased in the 1920s before their marriage. And I began using it, and an opportunity came along for me to become an apprentice for a master photographer who had a great studio in Ada. He was extremely well trained, a graduate of the New York Institute of Photography.
I should add, this for about 50% of our audience, this is before digital. You really had to have a lot of skill. You couldn't do a lot of editing after the fact.
Right, long before digital.
Yeah.
And I took a job as an apprentice photographer to learn the business at a great salary of $7 per week, plus learning the business, and I worked 6 days a week in that process.
$7 a week, that's less than the hourly minimum wage now.
Quite a bit. So. But it was a great experience, and after I learned photography from the ground up, mixing chemicals, the darkroom work, printing, enlargement, selection of cameras, portrait photography, commercial photography, the entire process.
And that was right out of high school, but you also enlisted, didn't you?
I had enlisted in the National Guard. Okay. Prior to that, while I was still a senior in high school. And that was the beginning of my military career.
You went to school at Ada?
I went to Ada High School.
Now, I have to say, maybe people who aren't from around Tulsa or don't realize this, your significance here in the community is substantial. Is it the Broken Arrow Middle School or Intermediate?
There's a middle school.
Okay, that carries your name.
That's correct. And I had nothing to do with
that. But I've got to say this: there aren't a lot of living people who have schools named after them that I'm aware of. You know, think about that.
Well, there's a danger in doing that. I told the Board of Education when they were planning to name that school, I said, that's dangerous because you may want to take the name off sometime.
Well, so you get on, you've done a lot to have earned that, and you get in your career, well, you started National Guard, and then the Korean War started, and you entered the Korean War like 2 weeks after it started, didn't you?
Well, we were, our unit was called active duty 2 weeks after the war started, but we trained on the stateside, and then we were assigned for a few months in Japan, in northern Japan, in a defensive position on Hokkaido, the northernmost island, just off of Russian-held islands and off of Siberia. And we were in occupation troops there until November of 1951, at which time our unit went into Korea.
Well, when you talk about the Korean War, you talk about the Forgotten War, and you've written a book about it, and the title of that is Tony Duffel Bag. I'm interested to hear, because I only got through part of the book, and I obviously understand a little bit about it, but there's so much more that I just didn't have time to read before we talked.
Well, Tony Duffel Bag is the name of one chapter that is in the book, and the book really isn't too much about combat. There's a little in there, but I tried to write more about people that we encountered and some of the experiences as individuals rather than the fighting that took place. Tony Duffel Bag is a name that we gave to a little orphan boy who was found on the streets of Seoul in the early winter of 1952. Two of my friends that had gone back to Seoul on a short leave, they had earned that through some heroic action, and I had written them up for a Bronze Star, and they were being recognized, but 3 days of leave from the front lines back to Seoul. Seoul was a pretty devastated city. It had changed hands 3 times in 18 months. It had been a multi-million population city, but it was down probably to 600,000 or 700,000 people at that time, and not much in the way.
600,000 or 700,000.
Right. It's now a 20 million population city, but it was.
Yeah, I mean, so that's like the size of the Tulsa metro area.
Right.
Take out some cattle.
Right, but all of the buildings, most of the buildings had been destroyed. It was pretty well devastated. But they were there, and there wasn't a hotel they could stay in. They were placed in the German embassy, and they were out on the streets. It was freezing. Probably had warmed up to about 10 or 15 degrees. We had previously been well under the 0 level, but they found this little boy standing on the street begging. He was about 6 years old. He had no clothing on except what we would call a muscle shirt on top, and one wrapped around his lower part of the body. No shoes, frostbite, freeze burns all over him. And they said, we can't leave this kid. So they picked him up, kept him they got him cleaned up with some Korean they met. They found that he didn't have any relatives there. None of us spoke very much Korean language, but through interpreters found out that his family had been killed by the Chinese, and he truly was alone. When they were ready to come back the next day, they said, we can't leave this child here. Because he'll starve to death, and so they had found some clothing for him of sorts. It was oversized, but they got him cleaned up and clothed, and they were going to bring him back up to our unit. At that time, we had just gone into a reserve position behind the lines. It was a little safer, and they thought they would slip him up through the military police and get him to our unit, and we would take care of him until we could find some place for him to be placed. But they couldn't figure out how to get him by the military police that checked everyone coming back up front in the truck. As they got ready to go on the truck, they stuffed him into a duffel bag. And
so you literally snuck him in?
Well, my 2 friends did.
Yeah.
And when they passed the military police checked about every 3rd duffel bag, and they skipped this one. So when they came to the front, they opened up this duffel bag, and out popped this little smiling boy. We said, we've got to name him something. His name in Korean sounded a lot like Tony to us, so we said, we'll call him Tony, but he needs a last name. He came to us in a duffel bag, so I said, let's name him Tony Duffel Bag.
That's great.
And that stuck. And so he stayed with us for several weeks until the authorities found that we had him up in our position, and they kept telling us, you can't have this child up there. And eventually, we were forced to turn him back to the authorities, and they placed him in an orphan's home in in Incheon that had been established by that time.
How did that, we think of, we see war stories and things that are, you know, battle and shooting, et cetera, but you really are in a land of people, and you're there for a purpose, for the people, and a greater purpose, even though there are people casualties in the process. How did that and other things really change you during that time? Because you were 17 when you enlisted or joined the National Guard.
I was 22 at this time.
22, okay. And you were invincible. I mean, right? As everybody is at the early ages.
At that age.
And this kind of stuff makes you look at things
it
different.
Does. My wife and I had a child at that time. My first son was born while I was overseas. I had seen pictures of him, but I had not seen my own son.
And
so
again, reaching back into that time, that was before FaceTime and internet calls where you could see pictures and all of that. That's when a letter, or how did you communicate? Just by letter and photograph?
By letter. My wife was told that the fastest way to let me know that our child had been born was through Red Cross, and she sent a telegram through Red Cross at that time, and then the next day after that, she wrote a letter to me that was sent by airmail. I received the letter 2 days before I received the telegram.
Oh, wow.
So my son was almost 2 weeks old before I learned about it, but in that process, I had a great empathy for a child that was freezing and starving and begging in this country.
Certainly. What if he was yours? Yeah. Well, I've got a question that I have these questions that I go through just on my regular routine of how to kind of explore people's past, and yours is so different because what did you do in before your current business? Well, what current business? I mean, you've been dean of education at ORU.
At Oral Roberts University.
Okay, and the superintendent of Broken Arrow Public Schools.
Was an administrator there 30 years.
Okay, and you've been a teacher, you've been a journalist.
Yes.
Been in the military, obviously, we've had that discussion. What else have you done?
Well, obviously I'm doing some writing. I've become a little bit of a...
Wait a minute. Obviously, he's doing some writing. I would be very proud if I had a book, maybe a picture book, half the size of any of these. These are just some of your writing, really.
That's correct. I have some more.
Yeah.
And I have two that I want to finish this year. One that I must finish this year. But
what's prompting all your writing?
Well, I've always my career was a journalist, photographer and journalist, and I studied journalism. I was a senior at then Oklahoma A&M College. At the time the Korean War began and we were called to active duty, I was just about to graduate from the college or from the School of Journalism at A&M. And my first full-time working career was as an editor. After I returned from Korea, I began work as a newspaper editor in western Oklahoma. While I was overseas, I did some articles, even though I was in an infantry unit. When I had time, I wrote articles for the hometown paper in Ada, so I guess I was a war correspondent for a while, but had several articles that I wrote during that time. So I've always enjoyed writing. I've always enjoyed reading. Began that as a very early career during the Depression years. Any opportunity we could get to the library, we took it, and I can't remember a time that I was not reading.
Speaking of Depression years, there's Clarence Oliver Sr.
Right. And
you were telling me the story of your father. Give me some of your background as a young boy and family with your father.
Well, as you have already indicated, I grew up during the Depression years. One of my books deals with the childhood of the Depression years. My father grew up in the late 18 teens in the 1920s. He was a middle child in a farm family of 12 children. And the only education available in that rural area was up to the 6th grade, so that was the extent of his education. I think if he had had other opportunities, he would have been extremely well educated and would have been a very productive leader in his own right in the community, but he did not have that opportunity. He worked on the farm with a sixth grade education. I fell in love with the lady who became my mother, who was a housekeeper for a rather wealthy family in the Ada community. She was an orphan that had been adopted, and so they had economic issues from the very beginning. They didn't have any wealth when they married, and immediately a year or so, 2 years after their marriage, the Depression hit. The jobs were lost, and for several years, the only income they had was just odd jobs that he could pick up until the mid-1930s, when he was able to find a full-time job at Portland Cement Company in Ada, and he worked with them until he retired.
Well, always sounds to me success is relative, and surviving is very successful in a lot of places, right, and for a lot of people.
Right. He tried a couple of little businesses during the Depression. He tried to run a small cafe, and that was difficult.
Somebody has to have the money to be your customer.
That's right. And that didn't work. And he did some door-to-door salesman of Stanley products, and he tried that for a while and different things, but none of those were successful businesses during the Depression years.
Well, you say Stanley products, I think of my dad selling rainbow vacuum cleaners, right, when he was in college, and so yeah, times were different.
They do what they can do to support the family.
Well, I would like to mention a few of your books that you've got here, and a memoir of a Depression era kid, one from the least and disappearing generation.
That's correct. The disappearing generation. That was the least. That was the smallest generation in the history of the United States in recent years. The Depression era children, those born in the late 1920s and the early 1930s, are about 30 million fewer in total number in the nation than our parents' generation, and about 50 million fewer than our children's generation. So it's the smallest generation in recent decades, a recent century, and disappearing obviously because of our age. All of that age group are now in their 80s generally, and we're disappearing rapidly.
Well, and the stories are disappearing too, which is why I look at something like this, and I consider this extremely valuable. What about, you know, these numbers, and I find that interesting too. I'm shifting gears a little bit here because I'm watching numbers as a real estate agent. I have to look at where are the demographics going. As people age, they want smaller yards and less to take care of. You know, there's a condominium boom in the 70s, and then now we have more of a retirement housing boom, and so these things affect what people buy and sell. I'm curious, as we're talking about the kind of the sentimental side of it, there's also a side to business and success and things that people have to watch from a factual standpoint. What's your take on all of that? How do you look at that?
Well, you do have to be very observant of what has occurred, what is occurring, what is likely to occur in the future. And I think anyone who's going to be successful in business has to do some extremely good long-range planning. You're in business and you do a lot of that, but you have to be aware of the factors that are influencing behavior of people. In your real estate business, you're very much aware that there are both young couples who do not have children who are moving back to the urban centers, and they like loft apartments and those things right down in the business part of town. That's occurring, and people who are observant of that are making those available to them.
That was a side note. Quite up to date. Quite up to date, by the way. I tell you, A Time of Peace, Season of Innocence. I actually passed this book around with my kids.
Okay.
And it's got lots of pictures in it. I guess it's mostly pictures, you could say, with long descriptions. And I found it quite fascinating. As I showed the picture, can you get this on the camera? And I was just thumbing through it. I didn't really have a chance to look at that much, and it didn't take long for me to find things that were very interesting. Here's a young man who was coming back from college and hitchhiking.
He and I were hitchhiking. That was my roommate.
You were with him?
Yes, I took the picture. All the pictures are mine. But
here's what I turned to my wife and I said, could you imagine any of our kids hitchhiking back home and that being okay? I mean,
that's the only way we had to get home. We did not have money to buy a bus ticket, so we hitchhiked.
Well,
and sometimes it might take 3 hours to get to Ada. Sometimes it might take 12 hours.
Well, here's when it says a season of innocence.
That's
it
right.
really meant that, because
it really
you could trust somebody on the side. You pick him up on the side of the road, and you were doing a good deed.
That's right.
How about this one? The Five Amigos.
Five Amigos. Five of us after high school.
I love the story.
Decided that we wanted to take a 2-week tour of several states. We pooled our money and got a used car from the father of one of the boys. Hooked up a big trailer, and we traveled for 2 weeks through several countries, several states in the mountainous area.
But it gets much better, because you almost didn't make it home.
That's true.
And you were considering becoming day laborers to learn or to earn the rest of the money you needed, because you had to fix a tire or something. You ran out of money because you fixed a tire.
No, we had to replace the brakes on the car when we had a stupid incident coming down Pikes Peak that ruined the brakes, and it took all the money that all five of us had to get the brakes fixed, and we didn't have enough money to get home. We didn't think, so we even thought about trying to get a job as cherry pickers, because it was cherry season in Colorado, but all those jobs were taken. So,
where do you get these? Where can you get these books?
Amazon has some. The Time of Peace is a limited edition book, and it's available at locations in Broken Arrow, the bookstore, the museum, the historical museum, the military museum. Can be ordered online through that bookstore, but those are limited in number.
Well,
the others are available on Amazon and in bookstores.
They're not limiting in fascination, because really they've got some good stuff in there, and I can't wait to go back. This one's going to sit on my coffee table. I appreciate history, I really do. And speaking of history, we're going much longer than normal, because there's no way we could fit all that in. I want to know, after this break, I want to find out more about your perspectives on Broken Arrow and the way it's changed, and just some of the stories that you might have to say.
That would be exciting. I've been in Broken Arrow since it was a city of 3,000 people, so I have been a part of that growth from 3,000 to 107,000.
Well, I want to hear about it, so stay tuned. We'll be back on Success with Significance right after this. Welcome to Bixby, Oklahoma, the fast-growing suburb of Tulsa, where home values are among the best in the nation. Here in the gate-guarded community of Stanford Elm resides an attractive country French architecture, curved streets, towering trees, and the peaceful ambiance of a flowing creek and water fountains. Step inside this beautiful home for sale and see more of the quality of life features Bixby, Oklahoma has to offer. Designed by Oklahoma's famed architect, Jack Arnold, this home has a cozy feel of a comfortable cottage with expansive living areas you would expect in a large luxury home. Inviting, formal rooms ready to greet guests and entertain with the convenience of a butler's hall and pantry. 4 bedrooms, a master suite on the first floor with a spacious, open bathroom are the true sense of luxury. Enjoy this open game room and family living area upstairs, where games and movies won't disturb others. For more information about this home for sale in Stanford Elm or others available in the Bixby, Oklahoma area, contact the Baskin Real Estate Specialists at eXp Realty, 918-740-0077, or online at homeguidetulsa.com. I'm Darryl Baskin. We're visiting with Dr. Clarence Oliver, Jr., and the topic now shifting to Broken Arrow and the history. You were in Broken Arrow when it was a town of 3,000 people, and now are we the second largest or third, whatever it is? It's the fastest growing. I think it's now become that. But what, 170?
107,000.
107. Okay. A lot's changing. It's with the Rose District and things downtown. I mean, downtown's coming back, and Broken Arrow now is becoming its own little hotspot, competing with parts of downtown Tulsa.
That's correct.
And what do you tell us stories about that?
Well, it's been very exciting to be a part of a community and be involved in all that growth from the time it was a 3,000 population until the 107,000. And the population of Broken Arrow for the first half century really didn't change a great deal. After the initial surge of about 2,000 people, shortly after the town was established in 1902, it leveled off at about 2,000 and very gradually grew for the next 5 decades until it was about 3,000. The growth really began in the 1960s. Began to pick up, but the massive growth came in the 1970s and 80s when, as part of this, I was with the school district, in part because of the oil boom, and in part because Tulsa had a great number of corporate headquarters located there. The oil industry was there. People were moving into the area. The housing in Tulsa was a little more expensive than it was in the rural area, and people began to recognize that even though Broken Arrow was 20 miles from downtown Tulsa, that it was worth the drive to be able to be in a smaller community that had an excellent school system, it was a nice self-sustained community, had new housing that was being built, and it was affordable for the young couples. So a lot of young families moved there. During the rapid growth in the school system, when for several years the growth was averaging 18 to 20% net increase per year in students. The median age in Broken Arrow was 26, so you can see there was a lot of young families.
Wow.
It's now approaching 37 or 38 as the median age. So it's a maturing population. It's still growing, and the school system growth is continuing, but not at the rate that it had been. At one point, the 25% of the community's total population was in school, ages 5 to 17. So it was a really young community, and it was exciting to be a part of that, but it was challenging to be a part of that.
Well, and when did the Broken Arrow Expressway come about? Was that in the 60s?
Early 1960s. 1962 was the completion of that, the opening of that.
I remember something in one of the Tulsa history videos of Utica Square and the Broken Arrow Expressway, and I couldn't remember exactly when that was, but I just remember some lady was driving too fast in the parking lot of Utica Square on the video. So either sped it up or she needed to be slowing down. It could be a kid walking across there or something.
Well, that's an interesting thing. So you're very familiar with Memorial, pardon me, because your office is on it.
Right.
At the time we moved here, the corner of 71st and Memorial, where Woodland Hills and all that development is, there was nothing there but a hanging, flashing light in the center of that intersection. There was a bar on the southwest corner. There was an open market, country market, farmer's market garden spot on the northeast corner, and nothing else was there.
Wow.
And that was in the late 1950s.
So Broken Arrow was its own town,
yes.
And I'm sure there was a lot happening in the downtown area. That declined. You saw this change. Indian Springs Golf Club was, I guess, established during your
70s, yes.
your era of,
Right.
you ran the schools from when? You were superintendent when?
Well, I was an administrator there from 1961 to 1992.
Okay. So it's hard to go wrong. If I just pick a time in Broken Arrow, you were probably there. What stands out to you? If you looked, I'm always interested, let me say this, I'm always interested in what people consider a success. Maybe everyone else may look at you and say, oh, look at how successful he is because of whatever. And there may have been something much more of an impact to you during that time period. I'm specifically thinking about Broken Arrow, maybe something small people don't know about. And also your failure. What do you wish you could have done different? And maybe not so much from a failure standpoint, but if I could have looking back, I wish I could have done it this way.
I'm not sure I would change a whole lot that I was able to do. I think it was I think it's very important in planning for the future that you have some specific goals. At the time, Broken Arrow was growing so rapidly, people were moving in from all parts of the nation. And as we visited with people, I began to ask them, what do you consider to be your home? What's your hometown? I guess I was looking for. And I had recently finished reading Vance Packard's book, A Nation of Strangers, in which he had written about all the transition of people across the nation, and that people were not putting down roots anywhere. So I had established as our goal that all these newcomers to Broken Arrow, we were going to try to make them have a sense of community, a sense of belonging to Broken Arrow. And we devoted an awful lot of effort, both in the school system and in the community, in the Chamber of Commerce and the Civic Club, trying to convince the people who were new to Broken Arrow to stay in Broken Arrow, to put their roots down here. It was a great community, and we wanted them to stay here. We had visited with one family, and I asked this woman, I said, where are you from? And she said, well, that's interesting. She said, I may have the states mixed up, but she said, I was born in Alabama. My husband was born in Pennsylvania. We met in college and married. Our first child was born in Pennsylvania. Our second child was born in California. We had been shifted out there by a corporate move. Our third child was born back in Alabama. We're now in Broken Arrow. And she said, I don't know what home is. And so I began to address that group. I feel a great deal of accomplishment in that a lot of those people we targeted did stay in Broken Arrow. We felt they put down roots.
I kind of identify with what you're saying. I was a preacher's kid. We moved all over when I was a kid. And yet people say, where are you from? And I would at one time tell them, these different places, but I said, none of the other places matter. I'm from Tulsa, Broken Arrow, wherever I was living at the time. But we did call that home. Yeah. Maybe I'm a product of that.
Well, I hope so.
So you saw all that grow, and then as you were winding down at Broken Arrow schools, what was it like when you left?
Well, we were involved at that particular time in some collective bargaining that I did not enjoy, that aspect of education. I think that it took away from the real focus on education. That was a major factor, I think, in my decision to leave at that particular time. The other factor was that you were talking about doing things differently. The one thing that I think that I had failed to do was to give proper time to my family, vacation time in particular. I spent a lot of time with family, but I was so involved in the growth of the community and the difficulty of operating a major school system with finances that were challenging and the growth that was challenging, that I failed to take enough vacation time with family.
So a lot of pressure and a lot of distractions.
Right.
Let me make a note of that. That does take me to one of my questions, which was great grandkids.
Yes.
What is that like?
It's wonderful.
I mean, I'm beginning to understand what it's like to have grandkids, because you do all the fun stuff and then you just say here, and then you give them back, and mom and dad takes care of them. But great grandkids, how many do you have?
Well, we have 3 great-grandchildren, and we'll have 2 more this year. In fact, one is due this month, so my family is growing, with the exception of one grandson who he and his wife, and they're expecting. I live in Arizona. All the rest of them live in the metro area. I'm within 20 to 30 minutes of every member of my immediate family, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and that's wonderful.
Well, congratulations, by the way. I'll just close with this. Every time I'm around you, which I'm fortunate enough to be around you periodically, and a little more recently, every time you open your mouth, you have something wise to say, and I'm listening. And I think a lot of people are. And by the life that you've lived, the things that you've done, it's pretty impressive. And it's a pleasure to know you. And thank you for the books, by the way. That'll keep me busy for a little bit. And you look for pardon me. Look for Dr. Oliver speaking around town. You're going to be at Sunrise Rotary, you said?
Yes.
And you give tours at Broken Arrow Historical Society?
Historical Society, sometimes twice a year. We'll offer a guided bus tour of historical sites in Broken Arrow that I've.
How do you market that? I mean, how do people find out about it? Because I'd like my agents to go on that.
The Historical Society website is about the only place, and through the membership and word of mouth, buses only handle 43 people, and they fill it. In fact, there's a waiting list on some of those.
The elite get to go on the bus tour.
No,
I don't mean that about it. The ones that are signed up become
those
the elite.
Who act quickly.
Yeah. Well, that's good stuff, and thank you very much for your time. I know you are speaking all the time. People are asking you to speak all the time, and just taking a moment to visit with me is a real privilege.
In my honor, Darryl.
Thank you. You've been watching Success with Significance. I'm Darryl Baskin. We'll see you here on another episode next Friday. Have a good weekend.